The haunted lighthouse. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving the coastline shrouded in a thick blanket of mist. The old lighthouse, perched on jagged cliffs, stood as a silent sentinel against the night, its light long extinguished. To the villagers of Marlin's Cove, the lighthouse was a place of dread, a cursed monument to countless tragedies at sea. Ships that once sought its guiding light had instead met their doom on the treacherous rocks below, their crews lost to the unforgiving depths. Captain Elwood, a retired sailor with more years at sea than most could fathom, was no stranger to the ocean's wrath. He had seen things that would haunt a lesser man's dreams, but he had always faced them with the stoic resolve of a mariner. Yet, as he stood before the lighthouse on that cold autumn evening, a feeling he hadn't known in years crept up his spine: fear. It had been a year since he'd left the sea behind, trading his life aboard ships for a small, weathered cottage on the edge of Marlin's Cove. The ocean was in his blood, and though he tried to forget, the call of the waves was too strong to resist. The villagers had warned him against taking up residence near the lighthouse, but the old sailor was stubborn. The tales of hauntings and curses were just that, tales. Or so he thought. Elwood had been hearing whispers for weeks, rumors that the lighthouse was stirring after decades of silence. People spoke of strange lights in the tower, eerie sounds carried by the wind, and shadows that moved on their own. Each night, the storm grew stronger, as if nature itself was trying to warn him. But Elwood dismissed the warnings, attributing them to the superstitions of simple folk. It wasn't until he received the letter that he began to doubt. The letter was old, the ink faded and the paper brittle. It had been delivered to him by a fisherman who found it sealed in a glass bottle, washed ashore by the tide. There was no signature, just a simple message that chilled Elwood to the bone. Return to the lighthouse before it's too late. The souls are restless. The storm is their warning. Captain Elwood had spent his life deciphering the secrets of the sea, but this was different. This was a message meant for him, and him alone. The last time he'd been at the lighthouse was during the final voyage of the Sea Maiden, the ship he had commanded for over 20 years. It was on that voyage that he made a grave mistake, a choice that had cost him more than he was willing to admit. As he approached the lighthouse, the wind howled through the rocks, carrying with it the scent of salt and decay. The door creaked open with a touch, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling into darkness. Elwood took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever lay ahead, and began to climb. The air inside was damp, the walls slick with moisture. As he ascended, memories of the Sea Maiden filled his mind, his crew, their laughter, their trust in him as their captain. And then the storm. A storm much like the one brewing outside, where he had misjudged the winds, leading his ship into the very rocks below this lighthouse. They had been close enough to see the beacon, but something went wrong. The light that was supposed to guide them had failed, leaving them at the mercy of the sea. Elwood had survived, but many of his crew had not. As he reached the top of the stairs, he was met with a sight that made his blood run cold. The lantern room, once a place of warmth and light, was now a shadowy tomb. The glass panes were cracked, and the great lens that once cast a beam across the waters was shattered. But what drew Elwood's attention were the figures, ghostly, transparent forms that drifted about the room like lost memories. These were the souls of the shipwrecked, their eyes hollow, and their faces twisted in eternal agony. Elwood recognized them immediately. They were his crew, the men he had failed to save. "Captain," a voice whispered, and Elwood turned to see the figure of his first mate, Thomas Greaves. Greaves had been a steadfast companion, a man who had followed Elwood into the jaws of death more than once. Now, his spirit was bound to this place, unable to find peace. "We've been waiting," Greaves continued, his voice a hollow echo. "Waiting for you to return and make things right." Elwood's heart pounded in his chest. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice shaking. "To finish what you started," Greaves replied. "You abandoned us, Captain. Left us to die in these cursed waters. But there's still a chance, one last chance to save us." The other spirits gathered around, their eyes pleading. Elwood could feel their despair, their anger. He had carried the guilt of their deaths for years, but he had never imagined they were trapped, unable to move on. "How?" Elwood asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "How can I save you?" "The light," Greaves said, pointing to the shattered lens. "It needs to shine again. Only then can we find our way home." Elwood stared at the broken lens, doubt gnawing at him. The lighthouse had been abandoned for decades. Even if he could repair the light, would it be enough? But he had no other choice. He had to try. The captain spent the next few hours scouring the lighthouse for tools and materials. The storm outside intensified, the wind howling like a banshee, but Elwood worked with the determination of a man with nothing left to lose. He found an old toolbox, the contents rusted but usable, and began the painstaking process of repairing the lens. As he worked, the spirits watched in silence, their forms flickering like candles in the wind. Elwood's hands shook, not just from the cold, but from the weight of the task before him. He knew that this was more than just fixing a broken lighthouse. It was his chance at redemption, his last hope to atone for the lives lost because of his mistake. Hours passed, and the storm raged on. The lighthouse groaned under the force of the wind, the entire structure shaking as if it might collapse. But Elwood didn't stop. He couldn't. The light had to be restored before the storm reached its peak. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to break through the clouds, Elwood placed the last piece of the lens into position. The lantern sputtered to life, casting a weak beam across the sea. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The spirits, once restless and tormented, began to change. Their twisted forms straightened, their faces softened. One by one, they turned toward the light, their eyes filled with something Elwood hadn't seen in them before. "Peace." "Thank you, Captain," Greaves said, his voice full of gratitude. "We can finally go home." Elwood watched as the spirits moved toward the light, their forms dissolving into the morning mist. He felt a weight lift from his shoulders, the burden of guilt he had carried for so long finally easing. But just as he thought his ordeal was over, he noticed something strange. The light, which had been growing stronger, suddenly flickered. The storm, which should have been dying down, intensified instead, the wind howling with renewed fury. And then, from the shadows, a new figure emerged. This spirit was different from the others, darker, more menacing. It was the form of a man, but his face was obscured by a hooded cloak. His presence sent a chill through Elwood that was colder than the storm itself. "Did you really think it would be that easy?" the figure hissed, his voice dripping with malice. "Did you think a broken lens and a few mumbled prayers could save you?" Elwood took a step back, his heart pounding. "Who are you?" he demanded, though he already knew the answer. The figure pulled back his hood, revealing a face that was both familiar and horrifying. It was the face of a man Elwood had hoped never to see again, a pirate, one of the most ruthless to ever sail the seas, and a man Elwood had once called a friend. "Jacob Thorne," Elwood whispered, his voice trembling. "Aye, it's me, Captain," Thorne sneered. "You left me to rot in a Spanish prison, remember? And now you think you can save your soul by helping a few lost sailors? Pathetic." Thorne had been part of Elwood's crew many years ago, before he turned to piracy. When Thorne was captured, Elwood had chosen to abandon him, believing that Thorne was beyond saving. It was a decision that had haunted him, but one he had justified as necessary. Now, it seemed Thorn had returned to exact his revenge. "You can't save them," Thorn spat, his eyes glowing with an unholy fire. "And you can't save yourself. The light will fail, the storm will consume you, and you'll be just another lost soul in this cursed lighthouse." Elwood felt despair creeping in, but he knew he couldn't give up. Not now. Not after everything he'd been through. He had to find a way to stop Thorn, to protect the lighthouse, and to keep the light shining. With a surge of determination, Elwood lunged at Thorn, but his hands passed through the ghostly figure as if he were made of smoke. Thorn laughed, a cold, cruel sound that echoed through the tower. "You're already dead, Elwood," Thorn taunted. "You just don't know it yet." But Elwood refused to believe it. There had to be a way. As he glanced around the lantern room, his eyes fell on an old chart hanging on the wall. It was a map of the coastline, marked with the locations of every shipwreck that had occurred near the lighthouse. One spot, in particular, caught his eye, the very place where the Sea Maiden had gone down. An idea began to form in his mind, a desperate plan that just might work. If he could draw Thorn away from the lighthouse, perhaps the spirits could finish their journey to the afterlife. But it would mean facing his own death. Elwood took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he had to do. He grabbed the chart, rolled it up, and bolted down the stairs, ignoring Thorn's mocking laughter. The storm was at its peak now, the wind howling and the waves crashing against the cliffs with a fury that seemed almost supernatural. The captain burst out of the lighthouse and made his way to the edge of the cliffs. Below, the ocean churned violently, the rocks jagged and deadly. He unrolled the chart, his eyes fixed on the spot where the Sea Maiden had met its end. "I know what you want, Thorn," Elwood shouted into the storm. "You want revenge. Well, come and get it." With that, Elwood threw himself off the cliff, plunging into the icy waters below. The cold was like a knife to his heart, but he forced himself to swim, heading toward the spot marked on the chart. Thorn's ghost followed, his laughter mingling with the roar of the storm. Elwood knew he was running out of time. He could feel the strength leaving his limbs, the darkness closing in. But he pushed on, driven by the need to atone for his sins. As he reached the spot where the Sea Maiden had sunk, Elwood felt something change. The water around him calmed, the storm above seemed to pause, and the light from the lighthouse, faint though it was, reached out across the sea. Thorn's ghost hesitated, as if uncertain, and that was all the opening Elwood needed. Summoning the last of his strength, he grabbed hold of Thorn, dragging him down into the depths. The pirate screamed, his voice filled with rage and fear, but Elwood held on, refusing to let go. The darkness closed in, the cold numbing his body, but Elwood felt a sense of peace. He had made things right. The spirits were free, and Thorn's curse would die with him. As the light from the lighthouse faded into the distance, Captain Elwood's grip on Thorn weakened, and the two men disappeared into the depths, leaving nothing behind but the calm, endless sea. The next morning, the villagers of Marlin's Cove awoke to find the storm had passed, and the old lighthouse was shining brightly, its light restored. But Captain Elwood was never seen again. Some say he found peace in the afterlife, guiding his lost crew to their final rest. Others believe his spirit now haunts the lighthouse, a guardian against the darkness that once consumed him. Whatever the truth, the lighthouse remains a beacon of hope for those lost at sea, and a reminder that even the darkest of souls can find redemption in the light.